All right, so welcome to Talk of Christ, Faith, Family, and Adventure. This is our open faith discussion, and today we are going to be discussing the CES letter, but specifically a response to a portion of the CES letter put up on YouTube by the FairMormon channel. This is the one they do on the Trinity. And Joey, I'm going to invite you to introduce kind of this topic and our response, or your response to. You can either respond to the CES letter about the Trinity or respond to the video by FairMormon and get the conversation started, Joey.
Okay. Well, just by way of summary, so probably some people watching this video don't know what the CES letter is. It's a rather lengthy letter written by a fellow named Jeremy Runnels, where he kind of lays out a laundry list of criticisms of Latter-day Saint belief doctrine. Is that a succinct enough summary of it?
Sure.
And
we briefly mentioned it, I think, when we talked about
have we? Okay.
Abraham
All right.
stuff. Maybe. Yeah. I mean, he was laying out supposedly the things that he found to be troubling and what led him out of the church. Mm-hmm. And he felt like there were no, good answers to those questions. So that's what's contained in that letter.
And as we've kind of been going around in our back channel about, what are some good topics for discussion, one of the things that came up is that sort of a current event, the FairMormon YouTube channel has been releasing a series of YouTube videos sort of debunking the CES letters, debunking of Latter-day Saint doctrine. And they're kind of sensational videos. They're kind of wild and a little crazy and comical. They're intended to be sort of funny. So just by way of kind of introducing into that topic, and we may talk about more of their videos in the future. I don't know. Depends on how well this conversation goes, I suppose.
I feel like saying
you have a look on your face
right here. Yeah, let's right here pause and just say, what's everybody's general thought and reaction to these kinds of videos? What's yours, Joey? To the videos that they've made trying to debunk it.
I think I get where they're coming from in terms of trying to keep it lighthearted and not too heavy, content wise. And the comedy is kind of maybe a way that they think that they're sort of disarming, some of these weightier matters, I suppose. I'm not a fan of I'm not a fan of the CES letter either, but I'm not a fan of the way these videos are done. I've been kind of following Kwaku for a while, ever since they had their, was it called Three Mormons at first? And then they changed it to Saints Unscripted when Nelson came out with the, let's not use the word Mormon anymore. They changed the name of their channel. And they have high production values, obviously, like good camera equipment, good mics, and scripted, and out the nines, production values. But in particular, these videos, the content of them, I don't know, it's not super scholarly. They're kind of, and I don't know that it's meant to, like, if they're meant to feel kind of off the cuff, they're not really meant to be. I guess I would ask, scholarly.
Yeah, who's the audience supposed to be?
Right, what are they even really going for? Because we can criticize it on the basis, well, it's not scholarly enough, but they're not even really trying to be scholarly. So, what. I don't know.
I mean, I get the impression that they're attempting to, discredit the CES letter by, knocking and attacking, the author and certain points. But as you just said, since it's not scholarly, since they don't really go into depth, since they try to do it with this humorous attitude, this lighthearted sarcasm, and it's
meant to have the feel of like an SNL skit, or like it's a skit, really, is what it is.
Who is it aimed? Who do you guys think it's aimed at, and can it serve the purpose that they intend for it to serve? What are some thoughts?
I think that it's aimed at younger Mormon audience. I think there's been statements that have said as much from people at FairMormon. They've said, look, we produce all this like really academic, scholarly, high quality research, and nobody watches it, only like older generation Mormons watch this stuff, people that are interested in Mormon history and stuff like that. But people that read the CES letter and are becoming disaffected from the faith, they're not, according to FairMormon, they're not being reached by their typical content. So this is, let's get some young people that are more relatable, who can use humor, shorter, like 5-10 minute video responses that people will watch from beginning to end. The second part of that, is it effective? I'm not the target audience, so I might be off base here, but I can't imagine it's working that well. Like, I think most of their views are probably, ex-Mormons making fun of it,
I can pipe in for my 2 cents on them. Like, that, I saw them, and at first I thought, because like you said, I get that they're addressed to probably the particular audience that's young. They have a short attention span, and I get the problem that people don't want to read super long, complicated scholarly works, especially. And well, I'll say this: so the type of person that the CES letter is intended to appeal to might, I mean, this is probably slightly on a lower level, but it's also along the same lines that these videos might appeal to, and that they're really short, take a few jabs, and then, say, haha, got you, and then you get off your pedestal. But I think these
So you
videos,
feel like the CES letter itself has similar arguments?
Yeah, so that's why I think maybe that's a warranted response, although I think perhaps stooping to the level of a method that you have criticisms of may not be the best way to go about that. But I will say their strength would be in that they're definitely not the final word or even an in-depth response or even an adequate response, but they are a conversation starter. And so I think, because before these came out, and a long time ago, even like 10 years ago, people in the church were really, at least the more academic, scholarly side, was really seeing the rise of the internet, and then people having access to church history and the problems is going to have a problem eventually, because the way that the church presented things was more along the lines of, here's how it is, this is simple, we know it's simple, and the scholars like, wink wink, there's more to it, but we're not going to tell you there's more to it. So a lot of people were discovering that there was more to it, and since they had never heard of it, they start from a critical perspective rather than the perspective of putting it in the context the church would like to. Obviously it's going to be a spin in that direction, but if you immediately hear something first and the spin against it, then that's stuck in your mind. And so I think this is them attempting to inoculate some younger saints from bleed, because I think the main problem the church is noticing, I'm sure I don't know, obviously the general authorities probably didn't authorize these or whatever, but like, what's our problem? We're bleeding young members a lot. Like, this generation, it's not just our church, but just church in general, this millennial crowd and Generation Z they're not interested in organized religion, and it's hurting us. So how are we going to address that? Maybe FairMormon thought this is one way to do it.
So when they are addressing if people are reading the CES letter and they're having genuine concerns and they want those genuine concerns addressed, at least this is my impression, that if they come across these videos, I don't think they'll feel like the genuine concern has been addressed. I think that they'll feel more like, straw man attacks and, poisoning the well type, just a whole bunch of logical fallacies in the way that they're presenting this. And so people who actually have serious concerns, I don't think are going to find the answers they want. And so from that respect, I don't think the videos can be effective. I suppose, however, if there's a group of millennials who have heard about the CES letter or heard about problems and they come across this first, like maybe a group that is sharing these videos with their friends before they've read the CES letter, that they'll be inoculated to some extent of, oh, that CES letter seems pretty stupid because, these guys have made a whole lot of fun of it. And so, that's the only area that I can see this having some kind of the effect that maybe FairMormon wants it to have, is, again, people coming across their videos first and then taking sides against the CES letter before they even encounter the CES letter.
That, or yeah. I think one thing is that you can't, though this is obviously, like I was saying, it's an also 1-2 punch in the other direction. We're just doing jab insults to one another, but it's at least to maybe address that maybe someone who read the CES letter, because the thing is, usually, and I don't know, I can't generalize, but I'd say, if I'm creating this pretend Mormon kid and he's grown up, especially let's say in Utah, I don't know, your experience, but you're kind of, it's hard because it's the culture, so you're kind of in and out, and there's a point where you have to kind of make a decision. But a lot of kids, they're just like, this is a cultural thing, and I haven't really bought all the way in. And so they're like, all right, well, it's out there. And then if they come across CS Letter, it's like, jab, jab, it's all false. I'm like, oh crap, I never even thought about it. I'm out. Whereas if they come and they're like, jab, jab the other way, there's more to it, even though that's not the whole story. So they're like, okay, I can see I can't dismiss it so easily because there is at least a response. Granted that if you think that this one video or these series of videos is going to satisfy anyone's actual doubts, I hope that's not their goal, because I agree with you, Steve. It's not going to satisfy that to any degree, but it will at least let you know that there are possible responses. And because again, and sorry, I'm talking so much, but I think the kid that is affected by the jab against the church probably hasn't put in the time to know that there is this problem in the first place. And so he's like, well, I have this, it's all true, 100% black and white, and all of a sudden you change that for me and I'm out. Maybe I'm caricaturing someone too much, but unless that's true, again, I would agree that.
Daniel, can you talk to your experience a little bit with the CES letter and what you think, if you had come across these videos back then, can you put yourself back in that position and figure out how these might have affected you?
So my experience with the CES letter is interesting because I encountered it once when I was still fully in, and I wouldn't say it didn't affect me at all. I mean, there were some troubling questions posed, but I was coming from a place of the church is true. And so even though I don't understand these problems, there's got to be a good answer, and I'm just not going to think about it. I just wasn't in a place where I was really open to considering that it might even be true.
I want to suggest that maybe at that moment, if you'd come across these YouTube videos, you would have been like, yeah, I was, it might have just kind of confirmed some confirmation bias for you, you think?
I certainly wouldn't have hated them as much as I do now, but I don't think I would have been impressed by them all that much even then when I was believing, just because going back to the intended audience and what they were trying to do, I think that it's kind of a little bit offensive, even if there is some truth to it. It's kind of offensive to just say, look, young people, they have a short attention span. That's kind of a stereotype that might be true for a lot. But in my experience, the people that wrestle with problems in the CS letter are the type that really take their faith in Mormonism seriously, right, are the ones that are the most affected by it. So the type of people who are going to read the CS letter and not really care that much or be swayed by it are the type of people that might like these videos. But if they're trying to save anybody who's having doubts, the ones who are taking it real seriously, they are the ones that are willing to engage with the in-depth scholarly stuff, and they're not going to find this stuff persuasive. So going back to
videos,
go ahead.
These videos are ammunition for all the people who are like, la 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 la, I don't want to hear it. And this gives them an out. This is like a pressure. Yeah. It's like an escape valve.
The people who've already decided I'm not paying attention, like you said, I'm not paying attention to CES letter. I'm not really listening. I'm just going to go ahead and assume there are answers. And this is just, unfortunately, it's more party line than helping those who are really struggling.
Yeah, faithful members who like it, they like it because they're like, oh, ex-Mormons are so stupid, their arguments are so bad. And ex-Mormons in a weird way kind of like it too, because they think it's funny, and they're like, look how bad the apologetics are. And so it's like everyone's just kind of straw manning and making fun of it, but it's not really having the desired effect.
It's this unfortunate world we live in where in general, when you have a disagreement of position or policy or politics or whatever, that we don't listen to each other at all. We straw man each other and we fling, dirty arguments and whatever. And unfortunately, this video just seems to be like that. And
you're trying to score rhetorical points. You're not trying to actually persuade anybody or
there's no substance to it. It's just like zing, zinger, zinger. Haha,
and yet that's the kind of video that people are drawn to and watch because either it supports their preconceived biases, what they want to watch, and it just shores up their defenses, and they're not really listening to the other side at all, or they may be drawn to it because, as you say, look at how stupid this is. These are, this is the Mormon apologetics team is they're idiots like this. And so therefore, let's point fingers at them and say that they really don't have answers to this. All they can cobble together is a bunch of straw mans, and
one point of the strength though is maybe there's a lot of people, and maybe it's negative press, but there's the old saying, any press is good press. So maybe that's one way to look at it. People haven't been talking about these issues maybe before, and maybe this does at least open a conversation to a crowd where they wouldn't have. And I would agree. I think the blowback from these videos has been a lot more than they, for some reason, couldn't anticipate. Because the humor is juvenile, irreverent, almost like, I think if if I showed this to my grandma, she would be offended by them. My LDS grandma would be like, my word, these children these days are terrible. So like, it's not obviously there's no spirituality to them whatsoever. But again, here we are talking about them. So we probably were going to have a conversation about some other video.
But before we dive into specifics on this one that we wanted to talk about today, as we've been, what is there a better mechanism that we could think of that would appeal to the crowd they're trying to appeal to, that would provide the FairMormon arguments, at least that side, that would not straw man the other side? I mean, what is there a better mechanism that comes to any of our minds that might be a better way to present this if they wanted to do it in an intriguing and enjoyable?
I'm of two minds on this. On the one hand, as the atheistics, in the group, I'm like kind of pessimistic. I'm kind of the opinion that there aren't great answers. There are better answers than these like FairMormon responses have come up with. But I think even the best, most scholarly ones aren't great, in my opinion. They certainly haven't convinced me and most of the people that are in ex-Mormon circles that I know. So that's one. But two, I think independent of whether you can even formulate a great answer to the questions posed in the CES letter is just not being dismissive of them and like, you're so stupid for thinking that this is even a problem. That's kind of the tone of these videos, and that is worse than anything. Even if you can't come up with great answers, if you could just say, look, these are big problems and we don't have great answers, just be honest, say like, these are tough issues and it's understandable that you're wrestling with this because it is a big problem. Like, that is validating to the person who's struggling in their faith, whereas these aren't at all. These definitely, I can't imagine these persuaded a single ex-Mormon to be like, oh, you know what, the church is true, get back to church.
I really like that. I'd be interested to hear if Joey or Corey have anything also to add as to what they could do better. But that, tends to be the approach. We have Dave on here a lot, that Dave really likes to take with anybody who's struggling with a question, in the Latter-day Saint faith. He'll say, that is a big question. That's a big one. And basically, instead of really defending and saying, here's the solution, he tends to say,
it's so much better.
Doesn't bother me. What was that?
It's so much better. Like, my conversations with people, if they start off on that, I know it's going to be a good conversation. It's going to be productive. Yeah. We might, whether or not we change each other's minds, it's like we're going to come away from this conversation understanding each other better. But if it starts off like, you're wrong and I'm going to prove it, that tends to not go anywhere.
So this particular video, Corey.
I was just saying, I would agree with that, just in that the like the setting the stage for a conversation is important, and that's what you're addressing there. So if you're setting the stage for like, this is a battle and we're going to throw zingers at each other, then you're like, we've all been in enough Facebook conversations to know that's not going to help anybody out. Real open conversation is you have to kind of be vulnerable, and you have to be open to have your mind changed, even if you don't admit it. If you're not even open to like hearing out the other side and being like, I get why that is a problem, and like, or even admitting your own, like, to people I talk to, I don't know if it's helpful, but I like to at least be like, I have a lot of doubts too. Like, I have possible answers for them, but I have to admit that my world, that's the thing that these videos isn't wanting to allow people to do, I guess, is to have people leave a black and white simplistic worldview and enter the world of grays, where there aren't perfect answers to any of these questions. There are possibilities. There are, you can say, well, it is possible that, but it's also possible that, it's right in this way, but you can't say definitively either way. And it always, like I said, like it's one of my pet peeves when people are like so definitive in one way, like this is the way it is, and there's no other possible way to look at that. It's like you make me want to argue with you. It's just the, you know, like
yeah, and
was not
the way that the world is.
As we've discussed in previous videos here, it seems like those who are the most rigid in their faith, who believe that their truth claims absolutely have to be true, and who believe that it's got to be the way that I was taught it in primary or by my parents or whatever, that they struggle with these questions the most when they come across them. And then it's in our little anecdotal experience, they seem to be the ones who most easily discard their faith, because as soon as something kind of suggests that what they previously believed isn't actually accurate or true, then they got to question everything and perhaps chuck it all out. Versus if we could teach people that it's okay that we don't have answers to some of these, that some things are weird. Now, I know that doesn't satisfy someone who wants answers and to only cling to things that are answerable. But I think that if I'm just from the perspective of FairMormon, if you want to win people back to the faith, I think it's better to present this idea that you can still hang on to your faith with questions and without answers. And look at these young people. These same young people were making fun videos, but revealing that maybe they don't have all the answers, and yet they are still going to be strong, because here are some possibilities. Here are some things that maybe this is what Joseph was thinking or doing, or maybe this is what, you know, why the Book of Mormon text might have changed or whatever. And let's give some options for believing, but then say, but you know what, ultimately I choose to believe for faith reasons or whatever. Anyway, and I just think you'd have more people saying, okay, they acknowledge my concern, it's a real concern, but I can still choose to believe anyway.
Yeah, can I pipe before we move on to the next part? I found this really awesome quote recently, and if I can share it, it's actually about philosophy and the value of it, but I think we can apply it to the, you know, just the value of evaluating your beliefs in general, and maybe leaving options open instead of being so black and white. So let me read it. It's from Bertrand Russell in his book, The Problems of Philosophy. He says, "The value of philosophy is, in fact, to be sought largely in its very uncertainty. The man who has no tincture of philosophy goes through life imprisoned in the prejudices derived from common sense, from the habitual beliefs of his age and his nation, and from convictions which have grown up in his mind without the cooperation or consent of his deliberate reason. To such a man, the world tends to become definite, finite, obvious. Common objects rouse no questions. The unfamiliar possibilities are contemptuously rejected. As soon as we begin to philosophize, or question, I would say, on the contrary, we find that even the most everyday things lead to problems to which only very incomplete answers can be given. Philosophy, though unable to tell us with certainty what is the true answer to the doubts which it raises, is able to suggest many possibilities which enlarge our thoughts and free them from the tyranny of custom. Thus, while diminishing our feeling of certainty as to what things are, it greatly increases our knowledge as to what they may be, and it removes the somewhat arrogant dogmatism of those who have never traveled into the region of liberating doubt, and it keeps alive our sense of wonder by showing familiar things in an unfamiliar aspect." So anyway, I just thought that was apt.
I appreciate that. That's great. You know, the thing that comes to my mind as you read that is that certainly there are going to be members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, leaders who don't want us to even use the word philosophy or to talk about, you know, that we can be in this mindset of questioning. Religion should be about having answers from God and revelation, and we know what we know, and we shouldn't be questioning things. But I think in general, the funny thing is that FairMormon, though, is the place where you find Latter-day Saint philosophers. And why would they produce videos that shut down the thinking and the philosophy and instead produce this, well, these are the answers, and, you know, slap. It seems weird for the ones in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints who are most inclined to believe in asking questions and not having solid answers, to put forth videos that seem to indicate that asking questions is stupid, and there are definite answers to all these things.
They're kind of stooping
but wouldn't
down.
you say that FairMormon is the conservative side of Mormon philosophy and theology and apologetics? Like the liberal side is over in, you know, Sunstone magazine and wherever else, you know. I'm probably dated in the publications and the circles that I know about. But I would say FairMormon and like the Maxwell Institute and all that is the more conservative side that is towing the party line to an extent. I mean, there's more than some other liberal scholars, I guess, put it that way.
Sure. Joey, why don't you take us down a little bit of discussion on this particular video that we decided to talk about, which is the one on the Trinity. Yeah.
So my perspective is I feel like a sort of a neutral observer, I guess, in this whole CES letter thing, because it's written by an atheist and it's aimed at Mormons, Latter-day Saints, sorry. So, you know, here I am kind of the third party, like watching this, as Corey was saying, you know, the zingers flying back and forth, you know. And so when you say, hey, let's talk about the CES letter and these videos that FairMormon's putting out, I'm like, oh, I'm not going to have like anything to say about that. And so if I got to pick one, it would be this one, because it actually is relevant to my beliefs, because it's talking about the Trinity, right? So,
and in fact, they brought in a Baptist preacher.
yeah. So we can talk about like the persuasiveness of the argument in the CES letter. We can talk about the persuasiveness of the argument coming from the FairMormon video. But my interest in this is going to be how well did they represent what I believe, you know, with their sort of parody of this Baptist pastor, you know. And the answer, spoiler alert, is not very well. I mean, they got some details right that are almost always wrong. They did represent my beliefs well, at least in the sense that, you know, they acknowledge that I do believe that there are three persons in the one God. It's not modalism, right? And so there's I mean, if you'll indulge me, I actually wrote down verbatim several quotes from the video. I could go through all of them, but how much time do we really have? And to Daniel's point, now I can't even remember, Daniel, if you said that before we started recording or not, but Daniel earlier mentioned that there's a part in the middle of the video where they basically discredit the CES letter on the grounds that an ex-Mormon atheist writing an atheistic PDF trying to discredit Mormonism couldn't possibly have a full understanding of Trinitarian doctrine. Right. And Kwaku lets out a hearty laugh, you know, oh, there's no way they could have an understanding of this. And that it doesn't really go anywhere from there. They don't come right out and say, well, that means it's wrong. It's something they kind of laugh about and then they move on. But the crux of the argument that they're making. Okay. So the argument the CES letter is making is that the Book of Mormon, the original edition of the Book of Mormon, and even still today, the current edition of the Book of Mormon, that they contain Trinitarian ideas that directly go against like the later, or if you're towing the party line, always, right? Ever since the very first vision, right? Joseph Smith has had this.
The critique is that somewhere around 1835, Joseph's doctrines and teachings about the Godhead shifted, flipped. And
then that necessitated that he had to go and like quickly push some of these verses in the Book of Mormon under the rug and kind of tweak them, you know, so that they fit better with his new understanding. That's the criticism. So the main argument that this video is trying to make from FairMormon is that, no, actually, if you compare these verses that have changed, they actually, both versions of the verses work equally well within a Trinitarian system. And then they cap off with this really perplexing statement that, and it's the Baptist pastor that explains it. He says, well, the Father's not the Son and the Son's not the Father. which is true. They're distinct persons in Trinitarian doctrine. If the Father wants to appear as a physical person, he darn well could. Again, true. Seeing the Father and the Son, and this is funny, like Paul does in Acts 7, except it's not Paul, it's Stephen. So they got that wrong. And I don't know if they were leaning into the parody of this Baptist pastor who doesn't know his Bible well, and so he gets that detail wrong, or if they just got the detail wrong. Anyway, like Paul does in Acts 7, seeing the Father and the Son, like Paul does in Acts 7, doesn't necessarily mean that God isn't Trinitarian. Theoretically speaking, seeing the Father and the Son at the same time does not warrant a needful disbelief in the Trinity. Now, I mean, so far so good. That's true, actually. Although I can quibble with the way that he words that it does not warrant a needful disbelief in the Trinity. That's a kind of a negative way of saying it. I would actually spin it a lot more positively. That's
what shows
like
that it is a
Stephen,
Trinity. Yeah.
Stephen seeing the Father and the Son, or the witnesses at Jesus' baptism seeing the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit all at the same time. That those verses are positive support for the Trinitarian idea that there are three persons in the one God. So all of that's fine, and then it's not Quaker, it's the other guy.
If I can jump in here, I mean, I get the idea here that so the issue that should be debated is it true that Joseph Smith's theology and understanding of God the Father, Jesus Christ, and the Holy Ghost changed? I lost the track of my sentence. I don't know if I've just used the grammar correctly, but is it true that his theology changed from early when he first saw supposedly, I believe he saw God the Father and Jesus Christ, but that when he first saw them and started teaching about God, and when he first translated the Book of Mormon, did he later change his theology from one where it was one God, a modalistic, simple, one God, to three gods? Did he start believing that the three were three separate persons? And that's the real question that probably should have been in the CES letter. But what was written in the CES letter was, why did his belief go from Trinitarianism to a plurality of gods? And then the attack that is being made is that, well, even if his belief was modalism, that's not Trinitarianism. And so you've used the wrong word in the CES letter. And then we're talking and debating semantics instead of the actual argument. Right?
So that doesn't even get brought up. And that's actually my main beef with the CES letter, is that it uses the word Trinitarian, when really I think what it means to say is that the earliest verses in the Book of Mormon were modalist. And that they shifted from that toward, probably the common criticism is that it shifted straight from modalism to something like tri-theism. But I would say personally, like when I look at those two verses side by side, the original 1830 ones strike me as very modalist, and then the corrected ones do, that fits with Trinitarian doctrine. Whether it's teaching it or not, I don't know, but it fits with it at least. And what these guys are trying to say in the FairMormon video is that actually both of them work equally well within a Trinitarian system, and I would disagree with that. I would say that the uncorrected, the original 1830 editions are kind of modalistic.
And so actually what you're saying
is about the nature of God that I wouldn't use.
Yeah, can you define how you understand Trinitarianism and modalism? Just because I think a lot of people might not know the difference.
Right. Good. I don't want to cut off Steve though, if you had a thought.
No, well, I think that my thought is best after you've made that definition, definitions. Go ahead.
So modalism is the idea, and this is criticized. It's like the most frequent when I speak to more, and especially on Facebook when zingers are going back and forth, right? Well, how did Jesus pray to the Father, right? Is he praying to himself? No, in Trinitarianism, no, he's not. What you're getting confused about is between Trinitarianism and modalism. Modalism is the idea that there's one God, and he sort of pretends at different times and in different places to be three different persons. So sometimes he puts on his Father mask and he's pretending to be the Father. And other times he takes that mask on and puts on his Jesus mask, and now he's pretending to be Jesus. But it's really just one person. And so that view is very susceptible to this idea of, well, he's praying to himself. He's,
to point out, that's the view, as you're saying, that many Latter-day Saints seem to have when they think of Trinitarianism, is they believe, and they wrongly accuse Trinitarians of believing in, one God who changes his mask,
one God who's really one person. And
that's not Trinitarianism.
Correct. Right. So in Trinitarianism, we, and you can go all the way back to the earliest creeds about this, we distinguish between there being one being or essence of God and there being three persons. So it's not even one God in three gods or three persons in one person. It's always three persons in one God. And so that's how we avoid it being an outright contradiction, because we always distinguish between he's not one and three in the same way. He's one in one way and three in another way. He is one in one way and they are three in a different way. And so verses like Jesus' baptism, verses like Stephen seeing the Father and the Son, those to me I would take as positive biblical support for the idea that there are three persons in the one God and they are distinct persons. What I wouldn't go so far as to say is that they're three distinct beings. And that's the distinction. So Trinitarianism is walking this very knife's edge sort of fine line between modalism on the one hand and tritheism on the other hand.
Modalism being one God only, and tritheism being three distinct
one God and one person,
different beings.
Essence.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then the suggestion that perhaps should have been made in the CES letter is that Joseph originally was a modalist and then became a tri-theist. But what the CES letter says is Joseph appears to have originally been a Trinitarian. Believer.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then he became a tri-theist or a believer in whatever it is that Latter-day Saints teach. And so the language of the CES letter is incorrect, which is then causing this response from the video to say your language is incorrect.
Start out off on the wrong foot.
Yeah.
Well, no, actually, they kind of lean into it. They're like, well, yeah, of course the Book of Mormon's Trinitarian because Joseph was raised in this Protestant Trinitarian environment. And so actually, the original uncorrected 1830 version is just as Trinitarian as the corrected one is, that both of them are equally Trinitarian. And it's like, okay, that's out of left field kind of for me. And it like, so like the thing that came to mind, so the quote that they give is, it's important to realize Joseph was raised in a Trinitarian Christian background. For him to see the Father and the Son didn't denote an immediate discrediting of the Trinity. And then they go off. It wasn't until the revelation of multiple gods itself that it was clear that the concept of God as an omnipresent, immaterial, triune being wasn't consistent with the way that the Lord revealed himself to Joseph. So they're actually, and the thing that popped in my head was a recent conference talk by Elder Oaks, where he says that this was from his 2017 April 2017, The Godhead and the Plan of Salvation. He says, we do not believe in what the Christian world calls the doctrine of the Holy Trinity. In the first vision, Joseph Smith saw two distinct personages, two beings, thus clarifying that the then prevailing beliefs concerning God and the Godhead were not true. Okay, so here we have Oaks saying that because Joseph saw two personages, that right away, that just the whole Trinity just goes right out the window. And yet in this FairMormon video, we have them saying, no. Just seeing the Father and the Son didn't immediately discredit the Trinity because Stephen saw the Father and the Son, in Acts. It wasn't until some later revelation sort of clarified it that we then had our new understanding. And so they're almost saying that, yeah, of course the Book of Mormon is Trinitarian and it's okay. Yeah. And it's like, that's your argument against the CES letter? Like, it's just weird. It's really weird to me. The way that the angle that they chose to come at it from just is weird to me. And I don't know, maybe I'm the only one who thinks it's weird, but
no, I thought that too, because I was like, are they agreeing? They're ceding the fact that the Book of Mormon has views of God that are inconsistent with actual God that Joseph Smith found out later, and then that brings up more questions like, well, then why was he so confused? I mean, I guess I can understand how, they didn't address this at all, but Joseph Smith may have not had a full understanding as he was translating the Book of Mormon, and you'd have to take the the looser or expansion view to make sense of that. But otherwise, if you don't, then that opens up a whole other can of worms.
Mm-hmm. And then the way that they conclude, the way the video concludes, the Trinity is a rather confusing concept, and blanket statements in the CES letter meant to damage Joseph actually damage other beliefs as well. Given that the letter ignorantly attempts to explain both Trinitarian and non-Trinitarian beliefs, non-Trinitarian beliefs, the point is, and then this is the sort of the sensationalism, right? Point is, the CES letter is trash and it's faker than Utah's air pollution laws, and that's
a good thing.
End scene, Finn, and to me, but it's hilarious. It's weird to me. I don't know what to even say about this, but here they're saying that the CES letter, in attempting to explain what Trinitarians believe, they end up doing damage not only to Mormon doctrine, to also to this Trinitarian doctrine, which I don't know that Jeremy Reynolds cares about. He probably would be equally caustic toward my beliefs than he is toward Mormon beliefs. So I don't think he cares to be careful about not, also offending Trinitarians. But it's hilarious to me that they are the ones saying this when the whole video they've been parodying my position with this Baptist pastor who is like, it's the word. It's like, can I compare it to the pastor in the endowment ceremony? It's just like, it's the worst parody of a Baptist. Oh, sorry. No, and it wasn't in the version of the endowment that I received either, but like, it's just like, here they are like using the CES letter of being, not only is this, offensive to us, but it's offensive to Trinitarians as well. And I'm over here going, were you thinking about that when you parody, everything I believe with this Baptist pastor dude? And they even, like, in the middle, they offend Puerto Ricans. He says something about his wife leaving him for the Puerto Rican pool boy. And it's like, man, you couldn't just offend Baptist pastors. You have to also offend Puerto Ricans too. Like,
just saying they're attractive, nothing offensive there. Not that they couldn't get better jobs.
Okay, yeah. So, that's my take on it. I don't know that they necessarily represented Trinitarianism very well in the video, and that's really the only angle that I can come at this from, because to me, I don't have a dog in the race of, did they do a good job rebutting the CES letter's claims? Did they do a good job of defending their own claims? The angle I come at it from is, did they do a good job representing me? And I don't feel like they did. So,
thank you. So, does the CES letter, what do you guys all think, do a decent job then? And we've already addressed that it's using the Trinity wrong and Trinitarianism wrong, but does it have a valid point that there seems to have been a change in belief that Joseph Smith had from the beginning of his preaching towards the end about God and an understanding of the Godhead and so on? What are you guys' thoughts on that real quick?
I think it raises a good point. I especially I went back and read that section of the CES letter today in preparation, and I really liked the handful of verses that he points out where the changes are. Like, Joey did a good job of explaining why even when they changed it, it still doesn't necessarily undo a Trinitarian, notion of God. But just the fact that there was a change at all suggests that Joseph Smith, his thinking had changed. You get what I'm saying? Like, the fact that there was a change, even like as Joey said, even though the change it wasn't necessarily from Trinitarian to like a non-Trinitarian view, but from like modalism to Trinitarian, it's still just the fact that he was going back and changing things suggests that his thinking about God had changed.
It at least raises the question, right? And there may be good, faithful answers to it. And I think Corey probably is going to be the one that has done the research and can speak to that. But I've read a book I haven't read the whole book. I've read chapters of the book that interested me. But there's a book by Charles Harrell, and I'm probably saying his name wrong, Harrell, where it's called "This Is My Doctrine," and he goes into the ways in which Latter-day Saint doctrine has changed and evolved over the years. What I think is remarkable about the book is that he's not bashful at all about saying, in the earliest years of Smith's tenure as the prophet. You know, he espoused these ideas, and then right around here, and he'll name like the different periods, you know, the Nauvoo period or the Kirtland period or whatever. Right about here, it seems like there was a shift in his thinking, and he now is espousing this idea, and he points to like, you know, chapter and verse of like the lectures on faith and the different revelations that happen in this chronological order or whatever. And he's not bashful about saying, yeah, the prophet's ideas changed over time. And in his book, he outlines this shift from a modalistic understanding into a sort of binitarian, or at least bi-theist kind of view, and then finally into a full-blown tri-theist, and then the later ideas, you know, about you know, that we're all gods in embryo, and you know, yeah. So
more of a polytheist,
but in our back channel, when we were starting to discuss this topic and what we were going to talk about, Corey pointed out that actually there are some good criticisms of Charles Harrell's arguments, and so I did read the article you posted from Blake Ostler, your father, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on how do you rebut that idea that the prophets, or do you rebut it at all? Did the prophets' views change? How did they change? Or would you explain, I mean, maybe the towing the party line idea about this is, well, those verses never really changed. They were always meant to say what they say now, and there were printers errors or something in that first edition, you know, and so what was supposed to be printed didn't get printed.
Or just as a towing the party line suggestion, or simply just that Joseph felt that this reference to the Son of God was unclear, that he felt always that this particular spot in the scripture should have been a reference to Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And so he wanted to clarify it slightly by putting in a couple words to make that clear.
And a corollary to what that idea is it okay for Smith to even do that, right? And I think, and this gets back to something we talked about in one of our videos, or maybe you guys talked about it without me last week, this idea of, is it a tight translation? Is it a loose translation? Like, is it okay for the prophet to make these corrections over time? And does that necessarily show an evolution in his own thought? Or is he just trying to clarify things he didn't get right the first time? And it's okay.
As a short response, if it's okay for him to correct the words of Moses and Matthew and Mark and others, it should surely be okay for him to correct his own translation. I mean, if you already give him that, then you've got to give him the other, right? I would think. But anyway, Corey, chime in for a minute and maybe take us home here. We're about out of time. So what are your thoughts?
I can't go into too deep into, you know, what would need to be discussed to make this a coherent response, but
and we didn't give you much time to research either, so
well, that's fine. Yeah, I did. I was maybe like, oh my gosh, this is a long article. Here we go.
Do you tend to think that the prophet's views changed over time, or that they were merely clarified differently, or even that we're misinterpreting it? What are your thoughts, real quick?
Me personally, I do think that his understanding of God definitely had to change from his, you know, like that quote I read. If he grew up in a certain world with a certain worldview, and so he automatically would have thought of God in that worldview of either Trinitarian or even modalism, because I know a lot of Trinitarian faiths do kind of at least imply what the Catholics call the heresy of Sabellianism or modalism. So that probably would have been something that was in his mind. So, but I take an expansion view of the translation of the Book of Mormon, meaning Joseph Smith did have handprints are in there. It's not just the text of the Book of Mormon, because it wasn't a one-to-one, in my view, translation because he doesn't know Reformed Egyptian, or the language it was purported to be in, right? And he didn't, for most of the time, he didn't even look at the place while he was doing it. So through revelation, he's getting something. And even me, like on my mission, I had to interpret for my mission leader one time. We spoke Russian, and so there's this guy giving a lesson on home teaching or something. He's like, "Can you translate for me, Elder?" And so I was doing that, and I can only translate concepts. There's not word for word translation. Me, because I didn't know Russian super great, you know, but also like the ideas don't translate word for word, especially in a language like Russian, because their sentence structures are totally different. So I would imagine, you know, at least the way I imagine it being is, at times it might have been tighter translation. We talked about this last week, where he's literally spelling out names or something. So you'd have to say it's tighter in those type of times. And as I think it was either Daniel or Joey pointed out, if you're going to bring up chiasmus or getting certain customs or whatever correct, then he obviously there has to be something it's real based on. But at the same time, there's a lot of anachronisms in the Book of Mormon, and obviously he relied on the text of the King James Version Bible. That's, I think, inarguable that that's the basis of at least part of what's in the Book of Mormon, and that influenced him. And so taking the view that it's a mixture between the two, when he translates the Book of Mormon, I'm not opposed or against the idea that he might have had a more modalistic or even tritheistic view as he went through. But as his views were, I would, rather than say changed, I'd say his understanding was enlightened more. As Steve pointed out, he felt free with any of his revelations to clarify what he was actually writing there, to go through and be like, well, obviously this seems like it is this way, and so it needs to be corrected. But also in defense of what I referenced this article. Basically, my father, Blake Osler, he wrote an article trying to say that at least there are at least multiple views. I think he would prefer that, the Book of Mormon is not modalist, but just like the scriptures in the Bible, there's at least multiple points of view in the Book of Mormon, which may attest to even more of an authentic thing. If there's multiple people writing it, you'd imagine there's multiple views of God. He puts forth that maybe before the time of Jesus' resurrection, the authors of the Book of Mormon understood more of a monotheistic in the terms of what, the original Hebrews thought, and that would make more sense if you're taking it, quite literally, that they migrated and stuff like that. And so they only had their understanding also. So either Joseph's understanding expanded or the authors of the Book of Mormon expanded. But in places like 3rd Nephi, for example, when Jesus comes to the Americas, he that's where you do point out against modalism. He's praying to the Father. He was sent by the Father. A lot of people that support modalism, again, this is just a shotgun version, they point out Mosiah 15, it tries to explain the relationship between the Father and the Son. And
it's a very confusing set of verses for most people.
Because it has a lot of language, but let's see, I can read this one.
So the argument there is, if Joseph were just going to clarify everything, why didn't he clarify some of these other verses, right? That's
maybe he didn't have time, he didn't remember. These were especially egregious verses, who knows? But the fact is that, I do think Joseph Smith's views obviously did expand. I don't think he right off the bat was like, yeah, there's, like infinite regress of gods. That, I don't think that's the first view he started with. But I also don't think that that's a bad thing either, because it's more of a scientific view rather than a dogmatic religious view, because as new information is presented, then you can see your past beliefs in a new light. And also you can understand, you just have a a better understanding or a different understanding, so that when things progress, you are able to throw out the old and accept the new without clinging so dogmatically to old beliefs. But again, I would argue too that in the Book of Mormon, at least, it's hard to say that there's strictly modalism, because in Moroni, he specifically says he's praying through the name of the child, and 3rd Nephi really, really, really would drive home the point that if we say that Joseph Smith was writing this, we would have to say he at least took a Johannine point of view, which is similar to what is expressed in John 17, the great intercessory prayer, where Jesus says, I and the Father are one. And so you'd be like, you take that like literally, maybe they're one God. He's like, but I want you, my disciples, to also be one the same way, and we are one. And you'd have to be like, so you take, okay, obviously he's meaning one, not like literally like one person, but some sort of other type of unity. And so in a summary, I think what the Book of Mormon has in mind, at least in my view and my studies so far, is something more akin to what's called social Trinitarianism, whereas they are three distinct persons, and I'd even say beings, because in Mormonism, I think it's we have to say at least Jesus Christ still has a resurrected body, and I think, that might be a problem for some evangelicals, although I know they have different ways of viewing that. And in Mormonism, I think, at least due to the King Follett discourse, you'd have to say God has a body as well. So therefore, they're distinct spatio-temporal people, so they can't literally indwell in each other, but they are one Godhead, and so their oneness is is, so when when we talk of God, well, I'll just read this really fast. Sorry. In the article, it had this really good point. It said it's of utmost importance to note that whenever the Mormon scriptures predicate oneness of God, it is always, without exception, a relation of the Father and the Son, or of the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost to one another, and it never references just one of the divine persons. So anytime it brings up oneness, it's always saying, the Father and the Son are one God, or the Father and the Son and the Holy Ghost are one God. It never just says, and the oneness of God is Jesus, and Jesus is that
Jesus Christ is the one God, or something like that.
I mean, there's a lot of other inferences in there. You're like, what on earth? The Father is the Son, and so, but I mean, again,
so
Trinitarianism has a lot of confusing language too. Not that that's a good argument, but it's just, yes, it is a complex topic. There are possible answers, as we went into, or possible interpretations that can make you not look like a crazy person for believing it. And I think that's as far as I want to go there.
A quick question for Joey, and I we're out of time, but I'm just wondering real quick, do you feel, Joey, that the Trinitarian doctrine of three persons in one God was well understood by Old Testament prophets and during the Old Testament time, or was it largely clarified and understood in New Testament times?
It was not revealed by God until Jesus came in the incarnation and the Holy Spirit was poured out shortly thereafter. I don't think there's hints of it in the Old Testament, but we can only read the idea back into the Old Testament after the revelation in the New Testament. So I would say it's very dangerous, and that's like Isaiah chapter 9, where it calls the Messiah everlasting Father. What are we getting the Son and the Father confused now? Are we confusing the persons? And I would say that's reading too much of a later understanding back into that text anachronistically. And if that's how you want to interpret the first Nephi passages, where at least in the original edition, it said that Jesus is the everlasting Father, or that Mary being the mother of God is actually not a problem because Jesus is God. So if you want to interpret those early first Nephi passages, which were clearly 600 BC or whatever Old Testament passages, were they just reading Isaiah and that's why they called Jesus the everlasting Father? Maybe, and that's fine, I guess. I think you're right, Corey. I don't think that saying that the Book of Mormon is modalist is way too simplistic of a reading. You can pick out isolated verses and say, boy, that sounds kind of modalist to me. But if you taken as a whole, it's not modalist. So I think that's too simplistic of a reading. But does that answer your question,
the summary,
Steve?
though,
No, I forgot what your question was.
No, that's the summary from Corey, though. It seems like you're saying that, it's possible that, and you accept this idea that Joseph's understanding probably did alter over the course. He didn't, as a 14-year-old boy, immediately understand everything there was to understand about the Godhead. And so his understanding did shift over the course of his life. And inasmuch as his own personal understanding is reflected and imprinted on the Book of Mormon, sure, there may have been changes. You're just okay with that. Am I understanding that right, Corey?
Yeah, and I would say if you believe in a tight translation, this is a big problem. That's why this is brought up in the CES letter, because if Joseph Smith evolved his view of God and that's reflected in the Book of Mormon, that would mean that the Book of Mormon had a misunderstanding of God too, which, again, like I said, you could argue that maybe the Nephites did have more of a monotheistic view of God. That's another way you could go.
Which is kind of what we were just talking about, right? Because, the Old Testament had a monotheistic view of God, and the Nephites were an Old Testament people. So,
right.
But
they also seem to have a very New Testament understanding of Jesus that no one in the Old Testament would have had. So that's
they knew that his name was Jesus. They knew all sorts of stuff that, I would say they were
pre-Christ, but they were pre-Christ Christians, and everything. They were very Christ-centric.
Yeah,
it's hard to know, though, just because they knew the name of Christ and they were worshiping Christ who was to come, whether that automatically means they understood three persons in one God. Right. And then we get verses like Abinadi talking to King Noah prior, hundreds of or however many years before Christ's coming, and yeah, making a statement that's quite confusing, but indicating at any rate that Jesus Christ and God the Father are at least accomplishing the same work, and working together. Well, thank you very much for this conversation. And does anybody want to say anything else that hasn't been said that needs to be said before we wrap it all up here? All right. Thank you for joining me, and everybody have a